Hey class, I felt the need to chime in this week because there's a lot going on and we're starting a whole new section of the book. It's actually our last section of the book. We'll be reading the section from 1820 to 1865. 1820 is shortly after the War of 1812. We're developing not just our independence from England, but our independence and our identity, and we're trying to create one, especially literarily speaking. The ones we were looking at this week: Washington Irving, one of the first ones to make a living as a writer, aptly named after George Washington, so that's interesting. Also looking at Nathaniel Hawthorne and his piece, Young Goodman Brown, which is in many ways a compliment to the Scarlet Letter. And the last one we'll be looking at is Emerson, who is essentially the founder of Transcendentalism, which is kind of a branch of the Romantics and several other things, but Transcendentalism is the American version of everything that was going on. So let me start by kind of explaining what's going on in this time period. There's a lot happening, a lot of growth, westward expansion. You can check the timeline, you can read your notes. There's certainly a lot going on. And in that, we have Washington Irving. And Irving is an interesting one because he spent a lot of time in London writing and actually sent it back to America. He was born in New York and sent everything back to New York from London, though he was not there. So he caught some criticism for that. But later on, he moved back to America and is, for good reason, typically an American, considered American. His first one's Rip Van Winkle. You've all probably read this one before. The funniest part is where he falls asleep, wakes up, and he's glad that his poor wife is gone, his nagging wife, because the only person more unhappy than a nagging wife is a hen-picked. No, the only person more unhappy than a hen-picked husband is the nagging wife. So they exemplify that. It's showing that things are changing quickly, and that just falling asleep for as short a time, comparatively, as Rip did, things have changed significantly. The other one is the Headless Horseman. We see him in Sleepy Hollow, and you see Ichabod Crane. If you've seen the show that's on TV now, it's on Fox, I believe, and it is totally wrong, totally inaccurate. He was a bumbling fool. The guy on TV is not. But then again, at the end, when we wonder what happened to Ichabod, perhaps he jumped into a grave and 200 years later showed up. I really don't know, but it's interesting that they had that take on it. Irving's interesting for a lot of reasons. He did several things. Let me look here to make sure that I get them all for you. First thing Irving did was he was the one that perpetuated the myth that we once thought the world was flat. He wrote a biography about, first was George Washington, and the second he did one about Christopher Columbus. And in that, obviously, if you think about his voyage, and we say, hey, he was trying to go to China, and oops, he was in Cuba and didn't even know it. He doesn't sound like a hero. But in his attempt to develop a hero, he said that he actually was afraid that he was going to go flying off the earth. And so, Columbus was excited and could do it and was brave enough. So that was something that Irving did that was great with that. But it's been taught a lot. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard somewhere that once we thought the world was flat. We never did. It really wasn't a belief. That was just something that Irving put in there, and after he put that in there, we thought that. So this wasn't something that was taught until the 1800s, even though Columbus had sailed, hundreds of years earlier. The next thing he did was he titled Gotham, called New York Gotham. That was not Batman. He didn't do that. Stan Lee was not involved. That was Washington Irving. Also, his pseudonym, Diedrich Knickerbocker, as well as Jeffrey Crayon. He, the New York Knicks basketball team, we've named an NBA team after his pseudonym, so that's pretty cool. And lastly, he kind of had the first occurrence of what we consider the American Santa Claus. There's been lots of things with St. Nick and everything else, but in one of his writings in his sketchbook, he wrote some things about Christmas, and amongst them were a flying sleigh. So that's, Irving's place in our history. All right, so to transition, moving on a little bit to Hawthorne. Hawthorne's an interesting guy, obsessed with Salem for a good reason. He was the great-grandson of one of the judges of the Salem witch trials who condemned folks to murder, to die, and so he was forever obsessed with that. He wrote about Salem. Young Goodman Brown is based in Salem. Salem is also the base of Scarlet Letter that you've been looking at, and he can't get away from it. He's obsessed with it, and so despite his best efforts to get rid of it, he couldn't. So he went and threw an extra letter to put the W in his name. Don't know why, but he did. And he wanted to disassociate. I guess that was his best thought, was that little W might make a difference. And so that was one thing he did. The other thing he did was, when he did Goodman Brown, is he was trying to, in a way, by showing these evils. When you read it, you'll understand more. There's some evils that he shows, and he's trying to show that there is a dark underbelly in Salem, and that there is a lot of hypocrisy. So this might fit into your something you might pick for your oral presentation, because it does show a lot of the hypocrisy of Salem, and perhaps in some way to him justified his grandfather and what he did. If there really was, if there really were people consorting with the devil, somehow maybe his grandfather wasn't all bad for putting people to death. So I don't know. In Hawthorne's head, that made sense. As you read the story, you'll see that they're at the end, and it'll make more sense after you've read it. You're supposed to figure out if it's a dream. Do you think it was a dream? And he leaves you not knowing. Maybe it's a dream. Maybe it's not. We had the same thing with the Headless Horseman at the end. We're trying to figure out Ichabod's fate. What exactly happened? And you don't really know. And so the idea of these things is that the unknown is far more interesting than if he were to tell you. I use an example from Big Bang Theory. I don't know if any of you watch it, or if any of you watched Married with Children long, long ago, back in the 80s and 90s. Peg's mother and Howard's mother. We never see them. And why don't we see them? And what do we imagine them to be? Because in our imagination, they are far more exciting and interesting and crazy than anything that those producers could put for us to see. So the imagination is something, the human imagination does a far better job than would anything that anybody could lead us to, I should say. So that's an interesting thought. So the last thing I want to leave you with, and remember that young Goodman Brown is very allegorical. You'll see as you read that there's a serpent, devil, faith is his wife's name. I mean, that's pretty obvious. And he's in the dark forest, so you'll understand it. The last thing, as I transition into one more thing, is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson wrote Nature, and Nature's a little crazy. It's kind of the original American hippie movement. The Beat Poets later on, they did the same thing on a bicycle. They wanted to connect with nature. And so Emerson was one of the first transcendentalists. He was mentored by Coleridge. Coleridge was English at this time, Romantics. Wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as well as some other things. And this Romanticism movement, influenced transcendentalism significantly. That said, the Romantics were art for art's sake, aestheticism. So basically, nature had a purpose, so it doesn't fit into Romanticism. But in Transcendentalism, he was trying to figure out that we all, we didn't need government, we didn't need religion, we just needed to connect with nature, and everything would make more sense. Is that true? I don't know, but it was in his mind. And so as he went through, he talked about commodity, talked about beauty, talked about language. Commodity, nature can provide heat, food, water, shelter, even transportation. He said could do all these things. Now, oddly enough, he based a lot of these things off the Native American culture, because he said they lived in nature and that they were not confound anything. And interestingly enough, as he writes about all this, he looks at the ability for people to conceive things in their own head. And so one thing he makes a point is, and it makes, kind of feels like the Matrix or something, he says, are we really here, or is this just our brain's construct? And the idea is that our brain is capable of amazing things, and that the only limit is within ourselves. And so if you look at what he says on page 243, he says, Adam called his house heaven and earth, Caesar called his house Rome, you perhaps call yours a cobbler's trade, 100 acres of plowed land, or a scholar's garret. Yet, line for line, and point for point, your dominion is as great as theirs, though without fine names. So is essentially saying that we are, our reality is no different than anyone else's. Caesar, Adam, I mean, if you look at the president, when he wakes up in the morning, it's his reality in his mind, just like our reality is ours within our mind. And we rely on social constructs, we rely on social conventions, we rely on the past to dictate what we do. And what he's simply saying is that we don't need any of this. All we need to do is look into our own minds and to connect with nature, and we will have our own type of religion. Kind of hippy-dippy, but it's interesting. One thing he makes a point to say is that religion by revelation. If you ever had a revelation, you thought, holy cow, I'm doing it all wrong, I need to change everything. That would be religion by revelation, right? Not necessarily that you join a religion because of your revelation, but that you understand better your purpose in the world because something has brought you to it. And so that's really what he wanted people to experience and to get to. In nature, it's complex as far as what he's written, but if you look at it and look at some of the ancillary stuff online, I'm sure it'll be relatively easy for you. So as we go through all this, we look at some similarities and some differences in them, and I've attached the discussion board with this as well as the notes. And I think if you don't like this stuff, just wait till next week because we'll do Poe. So if you don't like these guys, you should like Poe, because Poe didn't like them. Alright folks, appreciate it. I hope this works, and if you watch this video, wonderful. If people are telling you they can't get to it, I don't know what's going on. Alright, thanks.